So, today I'm going to talk about suffering and the existence of evil and how we can make sense of that. So, when it comes to understanding trauma, one of the things that you need to understand and come to accept is the existence of evil. Evil exists, and it is not the kind of evil that you can just ignore. It's not the kind of evil that doesn't play with your conscience. It's a kind of demonic and barbaric evil, level of evil that can exist and that can be committed by human beings. And the difficulty for people who have never had to experience that, because we live privileged lives, because we live on this side of the world, means that we can start to deal with evil with compassion. We think, in the sense that because we don't, or we haven't experienced this kind of evil, we live as though that kind of evil doesn't exist for other people, and so we hardly address it. So we never really have to sit down with the concept of evil, or sit down with, or reconcile that with the nature of human beings. And as I've studied, or I've understood my own healing, I've had to understand evil. I've had to grapple with that idea that human beings are evil. I've thought about whether human beings are born evil or whether that's through socialization. But I think that evil is something that we have to understand and we have to talk about and consider. What we're taught is that human beings are born good. Human beings don't have the capacity to commit evil unless something's gone wrong, unless something really bad has happened, and that's the reason why they commit evil. But I don't believe that is the case. I think that the reason why we say that is because we never associate ourselves with any kinds of evil. We view ourselves as good human beings, and we never have to look at ourselves in comparison to others or in regard to other people. What I mean by that is that there's a lot of suffering happening on one side of the world, and there's a disproportionate amount of suffering happening on that side of the world, and a disproportionate amount of privilege happening on another side of the world. And the people of privilege seem to ignore suffering and seem to ignore evil and live as though it doesn't exist, and live their lives as though people live the same lives as them everywhere, and people have the same opportunities, people have the same privileges and power as them, or they can get that same level of power and privilege, when that is inaccurate and it's not true. How the world has been divided is, on one side of the world you have wealth, you have power, you have privilege, you have so much freedom and so much happiness and so much ease that you forget that evil exists, and you forget that there's a demonic level of evil that exists. And the people that live on the other side of the world experience war, murder, experience poverty, experience the harshness, and are met with the harshness of human nature. And they're the ones that experience the evil side of human beings. And by evil side, that is also the selfishness of human beings, the neglect, the ignorance. They're the people that suffer from that. So they're the people that suffer from your ignorance, they suffer from your dismissal, they suffer from your lack of knowledge, and they suffer from your lack of action. And they're the people that can really truly say or feel the effects of evil. And so when you see in the political world that problems are happening on a certain side of the world, where there is a lot of poverty, where they've experienced war, where they've experienced violence, where they've experienced injustice, and then you look at them and you say, well, look at their countries, there's so much chaos there. But you've never had to experience that. We forget that we play a part in that evil system. And what I wanted to talk about today was actually very different. I wanted to talk about the existence of evil and how we can understand evil in relation to trauma. We have to first acknowledge that human beings are self destructive and human beings have the capacity for evil. Every human being has that capacity. Evil is not very far from us. And I think that we think, perhaps as victims, that we're very far from ever becoming people who commit evil, or we just don't associate with ourselves with being evil. And if we understand where evil comes from, first of all, our free will. The fact that we have free will, we can choose right or wrong. We can choose to follow our desires, or we can choose to follow our conscience. We can choose to be selfish or selfless. Those choices give us the space or potential to commit evil. Because evil, in the most basic sense, is selfishness, is being inconsiderate of others and acting solely on your own interest, disregarding other people. Evil doesn't just have to be murder and rape, it doesn't just have to be direct violence. Evil can be hurting other people mentally, emotionally. It's not just limited to the physical. And so every human being has this potential to be evil. And if you've ever been a victim of any violence or any suffering, you have to really be careful that you don't become evil yourself. You don't become the very monster that that you're fighting. And the example that I can give is feminism. Feminists started as a women's rights movement, and it now represents the sole interest of women, disregarding children, disregarding men, disregarding community. It just disregards everyone, and it just considers women. And that can be dangerous, especially when masculinity is celebrated in one gender and not the other. So, if masculinity is evil, and if that's what we're saying, that masculinity is evil, masculine men are bad for society, then how can we then say masculinity in women is a positive thing, and that won't lead to some level, some form of evil in women? And the masculine is more selfish, it is more self-centered, and so it has the capacity to be more evil. And so when you put masculinity in women, it also now has created a level of selfishness in women that is evil. And the very thing that women were complaining about men, and the attributes and the qualities that men had, now you see that women have the same qualities. And that's what I mean when I say that victims have a potential to become the monster that they're fighting. A lot of stories that you will hear from people who become evil is that they were the victim of the same crime, and so they committed it. And I think this is something that victims have to be very careful of and really have to consider and within themselves, that when you're victimized, what that will create in you is a monster. And that energy that comes from that monster can be used to create good in the world, but in a lot of cases, it is used to inflict the same suffering onto other people. And I can't really be sure as to why some people, having been victims, do not become the monster, or they don't become the perpetrator, and why some victims become the perpetrator. And I think the difference between those two outcomes is mindset. One victim will see themselves as a victim and will see life as out of their control, that they have no control over their lives. And so, whatever they feel, whatever desires that the trauma creates, they act on their desires. And so, it's them being themselves, but it's them being themselves after trauma. And they never reflect from a conscious level. And the people that stop the cycle of abuse, stop the cycle of victimization, they don't look at themselves as a victim, have created a meaning and purpose from that suffering. And whether they can understand their trauma or not, they see life, or they live life as though they're in control and they have a choice. And when you live like that, you don't get a free pass from behaving however you want to behave. You don't live life without responsibility. You have free will, and you acknowledge that you have free will, and you acknowledge that you have choices to make, and those choices might be difficult, but at the end of the day, you're responsible for your own life choices, and there are consequences to your actions. It's not that you're living on automation and you don't have no control over yourself, over your emotions, over your behavior. You do have control. And then I think that's the difference, where people who become perpetrators see themselves as a victim of life, and people who don't look at themselves as a victim. Another thing is that evil is not very far from us. We tend to look at evil as distant from us, that we could never be, that nothing could make us evil. And the reality is that we're not very far from it. We're not very far from being evil. And how we can understand that is if we understand human nature.